that does any good. Got to humor people now. People in the business.
That's right.
I'll just leave it right here. Thank you.
Stay when yes, Steve, when you're ready. All right. You okay? Okay, we're rolling. All right, Richard, please. You roll the tape. Mr. President, you will see yourself.
Vice President Nixon escorts Soviet Premier Khrushchev on a preview of the United States Fair at Skolnicky Park in Moscow. It's the official opening of the American Exposition, counterpart of the Soviet trade show in New York, and dedicated to showcasing the highest standard of life in our country. But on this occasion, traditional diplomacy goes by the board, and the story of the fair itself is eclipsed by a crackling exchange between Nixon and Khrushchev, begun off camera and finished off before the American Ampex color videotape recorders. Every aspect of the Cold War and Soviet-American rivalry is argued in blunt and forthright terms. The threat of atomic warfare, diplomacy by ultimatum, economic progress. Says Mr. Key, the Soviet will overtake America and then wave bye-bye.
He was scared to death of that tape.
No, I didn't want it out, you know.
No.
Says Khrushchev, he is a communist spokesman dealing with a capitalist lawyer.
All that I can say from the way you talk and the way you dominate the conversation, you would have made a good lawyer yourself.
But the culmination is agreement that both nations should hear the startling debate uncensored.
All of these reporters here, we have every word that you have said, every word that you've said has been taken down, and I will promise you that every word that you have said here will be reported in the United States, and they will see you say it on television.
Я видел, я сомневаюсь, поэтому я хочу, чтобы вы, вице-президент, вы даете слово, что моя речь тоже будет написана на английском языке, telecast over TV. Будет, нет?
Certainly it will. Certainly. Right. Everything that I say will be recorded and translated and will be carried out over the Soviet Union. That's a fair bargain.
It wasn't all that pleasant.
No, it wasn't. No, it wasn't.
That's all we're going to write.
Yeah, fine.
How do you say that, President, was not all that pleasant?
Because we came to the real kitchen debate where Harrison Salisbury covered it, sitting on the floor there in the kitchen, took place after this. This was
a preliminary.
That's right.
This was a preliminary in the
this
the
is
studio.
the first round.
That's right.
In the
When
studio.
You were showing him the new colored videotape.
That's right.
Yeah,
which I was seeing for the first time as well.
Yes.
And then we moved there and we got to the kitchen, and I was pointing this out as being a model kitchen.
That's right.
He didn't believe that. He said, "You can't tell me that the average worker could have this." And of course I said, "They certainly do.
That's
Steel
right.
workers have
That's
it," and
right.
so forth and so on.
That's right.
And then we began to, when we moved from kitchen to missiles. and
That's right.
It got very rough.
It got very rough, and it was a marvelous discussion. I thought you were surrounded by reporters, as you remember, and Bill Safire was the PR for that exhibit, and he lifted the rope, let me come in and sit on the kitchen floor, looking up at the two of you, and taking it all down word by word. It was a fantastic, one of the very best debates I ever heard. He was very good, and you were equally good, and it was a genuine confrontation that was positive. It can be both negative and positive confrontations, I think.
It was a debate. They call it the kitchen debate because of where it took place, but it was a debate about power. He was talking about the fact that the Soviet Union had strong missiles, or very powerful missiles, and I was trying to make the point that we should move away from discussion of missiles to how, for example, we could have better facilities for kitchens and homes and so forth and so on. But he wouldn't leave it alone. He was one, when he got a hold of a particular thing, he just shook it like a dog will shake a bone. And he said, well, now let's come back to this question of which one is the stronger. And I said, that's irrelevant as to who is the stronger. Both are strong. And then he moved the conversation over to saying that I was threatening him by indicating that we had so much strength and so forth. And then we went toe-to-toe at it. But we finally agreed that it served no purpose just to continue on those lines.
Well, that's right. But I think it did serve a purpose, Mr. President, because you had frank talk both ways. And I've always thought that frank talk is the kind that you have to deal with the Russians. Otherwise, they don't understand what you're talking about or what you really believe.
Before I went to the Soviet Union to meet with Khrushchev, and of course it was quite a responsibility for a vice president, I'd had some experience, but never at that level before, I tried to get advice from everybody, and I got varying types of advice. I remember Chancellor Adenauer particularly was very forceful. He had just been to the Soviet Union, and I asked him how Khrushchev should be handled. He said, you've got to be very firm. Don't let him bully you, because he likes to be a bully, and if he gets away with it, he'll just push you more. And then he related a conversation that he had with Khrushchev. He said it was about the divided Germany and what the Russians were going to do about Berlin and the access roads and so forth. And when Adenauer made a proposition, a suggestion as to what should be done, Khrushchev said, you can go to hell. And Adenauer stood up and shook his fist at him and said, if I go to hell, you'll be there. If I go to hell, you'll be there to greet me. He said, now that's the way to talk to him. I would say that beyond that, too, there were others who believed that the way to handle Khrushchev was not to irritate him, not to be belligerent toward him and so forth, and that if he made a point, just to move away to something else. That would have been a mistake as well. I think it is very important in the relations between the Russians and the United States, between the two superpowers, that there be talk to begin with, and second, that it be very direct. You should avoid belligerence, you should avoid hot rhetoric, but you should also avoid being soft, and you should also, by all means, not be taken in by the idea that if you're just nice to them, and if you're very friendly, that you can charm them. Charm means nothing to these people. And at the other extreme, it means nothing to have bluster. They're masters at bluff and bluster. I found that the most important thing to have in mind in dealing with the Soviet leaders is to be very firm, to know them and know the subject very well, even better than they do, and not to assume that you're going to get anything either by charm or by bluster. They appreciate that, and once you get the talk along those lines, you make progress.
Well, I think you've really outlined a prescription, haven't you, Mr. President, of how to deal successfully with the Russians. You come on straight, you come on frankly, you come on firmly, and you don't waste your time just throwing insults back and forth.
You don't waste your time throwing insults back and forth, or at the other extreme, you are not going to be taken in by the usual idea, which we Americans have, that all you have to do when you meet somebody who is an adversary is to charm them, and that if we just get to know each other, we'll get to like each other. That's nonsense in dealing with the Russians. If we get to know them, we may like each other even less. But that doesn't mean we have to fight each other. Yeah. And it's that fine line that we have to follow. Not belligerence, because they understand that and bluff and so forth. And on the other hand, not being taken on by a soft, sappy idea that, gee, if we can just convince them we're for peace, then they'll be for peace. We don't have to convince them we're for peace. We have to convince them they can't win a war.
Yes.
Once that happens, you then lay the foundation for real peace.
Well, you've had more experience in dealing with the Russians than any president in our history. I think, as a matter of fact, you've had more experience than all of them put together. And you also have spent half a lifetime in studying the Russians, often at first hand in all of the communist countries. Isn't that right?
Well, I have had an opportunity to go to the Soviet Union on a number of occasions. We had 3 summits while I was president, 1972, 1973, and 1974. I, of course, was there as vice president, as this film indicated. I've been to the Soviet Union several times as a private citizen when I was out of office. And I have been also to every Eastern European country.
That's what I thought.
And, of course, to China,
yes.
Which is a communist country. Very different from the Soviet Union.
That's a point I wish you would dwell on a little bit. There's a difference between these communisms, isn't there? Poland isn't the same as Russia, and Yugoslavia isn't the same as Bulgaria, for example.
That's correct. I think what we have to understand here is that we tend in the United States and in the West to perhaps a less extent. The Europeans are more sophisticated than we are because they've been around a little longer than we have. But we tend to see the world in black and white, or maybe I should say red and white terms. If, for example, a country is communist, that makes it bad, and that all communist countries are bad because the system is bad and it's an evil system and so forth. What we have to recognize is that communism, looking at it from our point of view, is bad. I would agree with that. It has certainly very evil features as far as we're concerned. But that does not mean that they're all the same. I remember very well that when I went to China in 1972, some of my strongest supporters who were conservative, as I am, and who were thought to be hawks, as I have usually been described through my years, fell away. They thought that I was becoming soft on the communists because, as they said, Chinese, even though they are having differences with the Russians at the present time, they're still communists, they're bad, therefore we should have nothing to do with them. They failed to make a basic distinction. The Soviet Union in 1972 then, as is the case now, was a threat to us. China was not. And what we had to do was to distinguish. You mentioned Eastern Europe. Hungary is very different, for example, from Bulgaria. And that's true of the other countries. They all vary in national backgrounds, and some of them even in the types of communism they have. And it's very important that we choose between these various countries and treat each of them independently, recognizing overall that while they are communist, that if we can move them over a long period of time toward peaceful change, that's the only hope to build a better world for them and their people and for us.
Some people think that the communist bloc is monolithic and it can't be changed in any way. But, Mr. President, you've observed Eastern Europe over a period of time. It does change, doesn't it?
I would preface my answer there by saying that in the period when we had all-out confrontation between the West, between the United States and the Soviet Union, and between the United States and Eastern Europe, I'm referring to the people of I'm referring to the period of the 50s, the late 40s, the 50s, up into the 60s. In that period of confrontation, there was very little change in Eastern Europe, and certainly no change, of course, in the People's Republic of China.
Right.
After we began negotiation, contact, and that was the period many considered to be a very bad period. Some seem to look back upon it and believe that it is perhaps a more positive period, the period of so-called détente. But in that period, there was change. And it's been my observation, generally, that confrontation usually strengthens a dictatorship. Negotiation and contact can weaken it. And what happens here is that as we have had more contact with the countries of Eastern Europe, Yugoslavia is one example, Hungary is another. They're making considerable changes in that area. There are even changes in Bulgaria.
That's right.
And so on down the line. China is still a very communist country, to put it mildly.
Yes.
On the other hand, change is taking place.
They've got a lot of capitalism in there now.
They have capitalism for a reason that communist socialism, Marxism, call it what you want, doesn't work.
That's right.
The Chinese are a very pragmatic people, and they have to have progress, economic progress. They realize in order to get it, they got to provide more incentives, so they move away from pure ideological Marxism toward some form, call it capitalism or what have you.
I think, Mr. President, and I don't know whether you agree with this or not, I think that there are some virtues which people don't ordinarily think of in this business of personal, first-hand contact with these countries. I did have the privilege of being with you in 1959 when you were in the Soviet Union, and I well remember you're traveling all over that country, and the administration, the Khrushchev administration, putting up hecklers to debate you in public. And you took them on, and I was in the crowd listening to the people, and the people were cheering you on. And I think you won a lot of friends for us by actually being there and exposing yourself to this sort of thing.
Well, it was certainly unprecedented, as you reported in the New York Times. I remember in a very long piece after we had what were called, I think you gave the term, they were the mini kitchen debates.
That's right.
They didn't take place in the kitchen, but we talked about the lives of the Russian people, the things we had in common, the ideas, for example, that we did not share. And what happened there, the reason that happened was that Khrushchev didn't like the Captive Nations resolution, which had been passed by the Congress before I came to the Soviet Union. He charged, in the first meeting we had, and it was a very tough meeting, he charged that President Eisenhower had deliberately had that resolution passed before I came, in order to poison the visit and so forth. Well, of course, that was ridiculous.
I think you used some barnyard language.
That's right, and I responded in kind.
That's right.
Which he understood. The other point is that he, after that Captive Nations resolution, he said, "You're going to hear about this." Well, let me go back. He used some barnyard language in describing that resolution, and he shouted at the last, he says, "This resolution stinks." And he says, "You're going to hear about it all over the Soviet Union." And that was one of the few promises he kept, all over the Soviet Union. Whether we even went one time, as you may recall, to the way down in 1,000 feet or so in a big mine.
And down at the bottom of the
Down
Urals.
at the bottom of the mine.
Yes, I went along with
That's
you on
right.
that.
And you were with me on that occasion. You were one of the pool. And a miner came up to me and he said, glad to meet you, Mr. Vice President, speaking through a translator. He said, could you tell me why the United States threatens the Soviet Union with its huge arms buildup, and why it will not agree to banning nuclear weapons, as we have suggested? And I said, yes, I can certainly tell you. The very fact that we are here in this mine shows why we have to have inspection, which you will not agree to, because a blast could take place here. Well, that, of course, won that little debate. I didn't win them all, but that one I won.
Well, it seems to me that you make a pretty good case for the contact and for visual observation and vocal exchanges in order to reduce the amount of misunderstanding and miscalculation.
I think I would describe the contact in various ways. It's very important, assuming that, for example, a meeting does take place, as I think that it certainly should, and I think it probably will next year. And I'm in a minority in this, between President Reagan and Mr. Andropov, or whoever happens to be the leader at that time. It's very important for the schedule makers to get the president out of Moscow. You, having been in Moscow, know what I have observed over the years. It's very tightly controlled, and people there are fearful to say anything. The further away you go, even when you go to Leningrad, when you go to Minsk, to Novosibirsk, to Almaty, or way down there on the border of the Soviet part of Asia, so forth and so on. People are more forthcoming, and give them the chance to see that Americans don't wear horns, that American presidents don't. I think that President Reagan can have a match for it. He can't do what I did as vice president, but let me say one thing. He doesn't need to wear that bulletproof vest in the Soviet Union or in any communist country. It's always amused me ironically, to have some Americans, when I went to China, I remember they said, "We're praying for you. We know it's a very dangerous trip," and so forth. The problem in the communist country is it's too safe.
Yes.
There is absolutely no danger. You don't need Secret Service. You don't need any vest, and you never read of that happening. But apart from that, I know that they probably aren't going to let him have the kind of contact that I could have had. It wouldn't perhaps be dignified for a president. But on the other hand, I should mention one other thing. It's very important that he have the opportunity, which I had in 1959, again in 72, and again in 1974, to address the Soviet people on television. They have television there. They claim they have 200 million people who can look at television there. Whether it's that many or not, I don't know. But I think President Reagan's appearance on television by itself is practically worth the trip. And of course that will be repeated when Andropov comes here.
Of course.
And it should.
Then I think that from the general tenor of your remarks, Mr. President, that you believe that it is possible to negotiate with the Soviet Union and make agreements which can be respected by both sides.
Let me put my answer in the proper context by directly taking on a word that has become virtually a code word and a bad word in the minds of many Americans, what is called détente.
Yes.
Let us understand what détente is and what it is not. Détente, as we practiced it in the 70s, does not mean we agree with the Soviet leaders. It means we profoundly disagree. But it means that we have agreed only to settle our differences, to talk about our differences, negotiate about our differences, rather than to fight and die over them.
Right.
Now, that way of practicing détente, recognizing that we have irreconcilable differences, we want peace, they want the world. That's very different. They're an offensive power, we're a defensive power. But having all these things in mind, we have to realize we have one common interest. Each has the power to destroy the other, and if war comes, we're both going to be destroyed.
Right.
So we have an interest to avoid war, and therefore we need to set up a process where we negotiate about those differences rather than die over them. I think that can be done. But it can be done in dealing with the Russians only if we recognize, first, that we have to have deterrence with it.
Right.
Having in mind that they still want the world, without war, if possible, of course. They still want it. We've got to make it clear that we have the military strength and the will to prevent that. Once we set that foundation, then, that's the foundation of deterrence, we can then have progress on what is called détente.
Right.
Agreements giving them a stake in peace, for
Right.
example. And I think under these circumstances, détente with deterrence, we can have a live and let live attitude. Let me go further in that respect, too. We're not just talking about arms control agreements. It's very important to do two things. By deterrence, I mean, in effect, that the United States and the West must develop the military power that will take the profit out of war.
Right.
If they realize there's no profit in a war and that we're all going to be losers, then we move from there to putting more profit into peace.
Right.
And that's where economic relations become very important. People say, don't trade with them because you're going to build them up. And my answer is, as President Eisenhower used to say, sell them anything they can't shoot back. Mm-hmm. And that makes a lot of sense.
Right.
The more they have a stake in peace, the less they are going to be aggressive,
Right.
in my view.
Right.
And so I would just summarize by saying, I do not believe the fact that simply the leaders meet and get to know each other, that's going to mean that they're going to agree, that they're going to like each other. I do mean, however, that as they meet, it reduces the possibility of miscalculation.
Right.
And war in the nuclear age is more likely to come by miscalculation than by a direct decision to launch basically nuclear suicide.
You know, Mr. President, that many people say you can't trust the Russians, you can't make a deal with them, they won't keep it, they'll cheat on it, and so forth and so on. What's the answer to that?
Well, the answer is that my experience with the Russians is that over the years, they will lie, they will cheat, they will do anything in order to win. But on the other hand, that doesn't mean that you can't deal with them, because if their interests will be served by keeping a deal, they will keep it.
Right.
And I would say this, looking at arms control, once we make an arms control agreement, we've got to assume they're going to stretch it to the limit. They've done that on SALT I.
Yeah.
The point is, we must do likewise.
Yes.
If we do likewise, then the agreement will be all right. I think what it really gets down to is this. We've got to assume that they're going to take advantage of every loophole there might be. So you've got to make agreements that are very tightly structured. But in addition to that, you've got to give them an interest in keeping that agreement.
Of course.
If you do that, they're going to be all right.
Right.
They're not going to keep an agreement because they like us.
No.
And they're not going to keep an agreement because they're sincere. They're going to keep an agreement because of the way it's being written makes it in their interest to keep it. And when we do it in that hard-headed way, we can make agreements, and we should. But let me say, what's the alternative?
Yes.
The alternative that many of our critics do not realize is that the United States and the Soviet Union, the two superpowers, hold the key to the future of the world in their hands and to each other's future. And it is irresponsible for the leaders of those two powers not to have contact, not to have communication, so that we can reduce the possibility of destruction for the entire world and not just the two antagonists. So under the circumstances, while I don't think contact and negotiation is going to solve everything, I think there is no alternative to having it.
Right. Mr. President, you dealt a good deal with Mr. Brezhnev, and on one occasion, when you were down in the Crimea, you were engaged in one of those negotiations, and in an interval in that, you wrote something with some words with which you end your book, Real Peace, which is exactly what we've been talking about. I wondered if you could tell me a little bit about how you came to make those notes, and then perhaps you could read them, because I think it makes an awfully good summation of what you've been talking about.
Well, the way it came about was that Brezhnev and I, which is incidentally the usual communist tactic, were having a meeting, the important meeting, not, for example, in the formal offices of the Kremlin, but in a little cabana. Well, it was a very nice cabana, because let me say, the new class in the Soviet Union, they live very
do all
well.
right, don't they?
They live better than a president, believe me. They're dashas. And so we were sitting in this cabana down there in the Black Sea, right near Yalta, in a place called Oryanda. And we were having a very, very tough negotiation. Kissinger was sitting there as well, about arms control. This was 1974. I realized we were not going to reach agreement. Various things had come up. Both sides had gotten to the point that there was obviously an impasse. And there was almost a tendency at that time, 1974, for me to conclude, well, it's hopeless. We can't make a deal with these fellows. We're not going to make any progress. And he was giving me a long harangue at the end of the conversation, where in a very mournful tone he was saying, well, I'm sorry, but we're not going to be able to agree. We ought to have to go on to other things. And as he was talking, when they're talking in Russian, I don't understand. I understand a few words. I would usually think about other things. And as he was talking, I made a note. And that's how I conclude this little book. The note that I made, which I found in my files when I began to write this book. I found it in my files, a handwritten note, written 10 years ago or 9 years ago.
Is it written on one of these yellow pads?
No,
like
it was
this?
written on a pad which he had provided.
Oh,
a
yes.
little white piece of paper. I have it in my files. A white piece of paper, a little notepad that they had provided.
Yeah.
I didn't bring along my yellow pad. I thought he'd figured that wasn't kosher. Anyway, it says, during a meeting with Brezhnev in the Crimea in 1974, I jotted down this note on a pad of paper. Peace is like a delicate plant. It has to be constantly tended and nurtured if it is to survive. If we neglect it, it will wither and die. And then I conclude the book with my observations at the present time. Peace has barely survived in the rocky soil of the 20th century. The violence of 2 world wars and scores of smaller wars has nearly uprooted it time and again. It has managed to survive, but it is far from safe. It is not a grim burden, but an inspiring challenge to build and sustain real peace. Given the alternative of suicidal war, we must not fail. And that would be my conclusion today. Despite all of the problems, and believe me, negotiating with the Russians can be maddening. You know that they may cheat, but you know that there's no alternative.
Right.
And so under the circumstances, therefore, real peace, a peace which is the only kind that is attainable, is something worth working for.
Right. It certainly is. It certainly is. Thank you very much, Mr. President. That's a magnificent statement. Is there anything else that you'd like to say that we didn't get onto?
Well, I might tell one of my favorite stories.
Will you do that?
That's right.
Yeah.
I can't tell on public television what Khrushchev said and I said when we met on the Captive Nations resolution. But, you know, one of the things about Khrushchev that I would observe, and you could see from this tape, he was a very colorful man.
Oh, yes.
The problem with many politicians today, and I'm not referring to President Reagan, of course, because he has a great communication.
He has his way, yes.
The problem with many politicians, both Republican and Democrat, in the free world and otherwise, is they're very able, they're very intelligent, but they're not interesting.
Yes.
And there's only one thing worse in as far as a politician is concerned, worse than being wrong, and that's to be dull.
Yes.
Now, Khrushchev, whatever you want to say, was never dull.
He was never dull.
He was an interesting man, and he had a great sense of humor. But also, as you know from your experience, I have found in dealing with the Russians that with their sense of humor, it usually has rather ominous notes in it. And it always deals with assassinations and that sort of thing, whenever they can get that in. Yeah. And this is the little story. When I was in Hungary just last year, the translator that we had, our Hungarian translator, told me of a story that was the favorite among the translators. They have sort of a little union around the world. This one, probably apocryphal, but it makes the point, allegedly took place at the conference in Tehran during World War II, where President Roosevelt and Prime Minister Churchill and Marshal Stalin were there. And on this occasion, Churchill was at Stalin's dacha. Stalin hosted a small dinner. That was the custom there. Just the two of them together, and went far into the night. Churchill didn't bring his own translator. He allowed Stalin to use the Russian translator, and he trusted him. Well, they argued far into the night because they were both night owl types. Churchill and Stalin were not alike in many respects, but they both worked late into the night and then slept in the morning hours. In any event, they went far into the night. And finally, after they had gone far into the night, and they were both pretty good drinkers, Churchill was drinking his scotch and a little later brandy, and Stalin was downing vodka. Churchill got up and said, well, I must leave now, and he went home, back to his dacha. The next day, he woke up around 11 o'clock in the morning, and he thought, my God, what did I say to that fellow last night? What did I say? And so Churchill called in his secretary, and pacing the floor, he dictated 3-page, single-spaced letter to Dear Marshal Stalin. I enjoyed their dinner last night, and this is my recollection as to what we talked about and what we agreed to, and had it hand-delivered to Stalin immediately. Coming back, the same messenger, came just a one-paragraph answer from Stalin, responding to it. The answer from Stalin said, Dear Mr. Prime Minister, don't worry about what you said last night. I was drunk too. And then there was a postscript on it. And the translator has been shot. That's the way they deal with you.
Pretty good story.
Harrison, I think Mr. Nixon would care to comment on what he thought the influence of Sputnik or the effect of the Russians having put the first
Sputnik?
vehicle in space.
Sure.
Yes.
Oh, yeah.
Sure. Well, when the Russians put Sputnik into I'll start again. When the Russians put Sputnik into space, it changed the world. It also changed the United States.
Oh, yes.
It changed the world because it not only led to the breakthroughs in space, but it changed the military situation, the balance. Before Sputnik, before the missile age, the United States had an enormous advantage because of the way that our airplanes could deliver atomic weapons to the Soviet Union. Now, we still have those planes, but on the other hand, the Soviet Union, rather than trying to match us in airplanes, which they could never have done, moved ahead to missiles. And that was why Khrushchev said, for example, that when we met, that while we had planes and submarines and so forth, that their missiles were bigger and better than ours. They weren't. But that's the way he presented it. And so under the circumstances, then, Sputnik meant that we were moving into the missile age. where you wouldn't have any warning time, maybe 30 minutes before any kind of a war could come about. So I would say that what Sputnik meant is that it made even more vital the necessity of having very close communication, the hotline, everything else, between the two superpowers, even though they totally dislike each other. They totally disagree, because you are not going to have the time to have long conversations and so forth prior to a confrontation that could lead to war.
Right.
It means that we must have a great sense of urgency about that situation today.
Seems to me that it's even intensified now, Mr. President, by the new generation of missiles, which, if I understand it correctly, can hit the Soviet Union within 8 minutes, and they're putting ones in that can hit us within eight minutes. I don't know what you can do in 8 minutes. It seems to me that time has run out almost.
The Pershing missiles, for example, that will be in Europe can hit the Soviet Union in 8 minutes.
Yeah.
And the missiles that the Soviet Union has on their submarines can reach us.
That's right.
And assuming that they put them into Cuba again, which they very well might, they might even have them there now. I wouldn't be surprised. They could get here in 5 minutes to Miami or less.
Yeah.
So under the circumstances, it does indicate the urgency of having maximum contact to avoid the possibility of war by miscalculation.
That's right, because one little one button pushed by some sergeant someplace could set the whole thing off.
In 1 second, I just want to get a little more down. And then if we could ask you whatever Harrison may have to conclude, I would like if you could share with us any kind of personal anecdote. We are trying to be as personal as possible in this program. Any personal anecdote about an experience while you were in Moscow? Something, if anything, you recall to mind that...
that's enough. We have to go ahead.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry. That's right. Going to get your hairs in
Yes,
place.
that's right. They won't stay, I know that.
Let me just just wait just a second. I'll try to think of something. I got a lot, but I want to keep it short.
Yes.
Perhaps something about Brezhnev, because we don't really know very much about him.
Yes, that's right. Let me think.
Did he ever show you his cars, his collection of private cars?
Yes. Oh, yes. No, thank you. Brezhnev. Well, I can just sort of reflect more on what kind of people they were.
Sure.
I mean, the personal thing, that is.
Yeah, that'd be good.
What we have to understand that as far as the Russians are concerned, that they at one moment can be very Russian and another moment can be very communist. It's like a Dr. Jekyll, Mr. Hyde syndrome that works. I have such vivid recollections of that, both with regard to Khrushchev, but also with regard to Brezhnev. We would have, for example, a very, very tough argument with Brezhnev, and then we go up to dinner, as we did at Adasha afterwards, and he would be raising his glass and toasting the grandchildren, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, I don't mean by that it was an act, either the first time or the second time. What I mean is that there are split personalities there. And my conclusion basically is this. We have to understand the world as it is. Russians and Americans can be friends, and everybody must remember that. We were friends and we were allies too. Russians and Americans were too. But the governments of the United States and the Soviet Union can never be friends because our goals are totally different. So what we have to do then is to find a way to deal with the Russian leaders as much as we can as Russians, recognizing also that as communists, that they do not have our best interest, to put it mildly, in mind. I think, too, that another recollection that I have of Brezhnev that is interesting is the way that he was so physical in his contact. He was a man who was always grabby in his conversation. Or when I was riding along after being in the Crimea to the airport in the car, and he'd put his hand over on my leg and this and it. I felt that I was in the Oval Office with Lyndon Johnson. Because Johnson also, I just think it's a shame that those two never got together. It would really have been a bear wrestle. But on the other hand, I would say that while Brezhnev was, without question, a ruthless, tough communist, he could be a very warm, generous Russian. He could be like a little boy with his collection of cars, for example. And he drove like a madman, practically scared me to death one time when we'd given him a new Lincoln, and he drove over the single-lane roads up in Camp David, going around curves that I wouldn't even take at 30 miles an hour. We were going 60. And after we got out of the car, he said, "You know, this car handles very well." One of the prices of diplomacy.
One last comment, if you don't mind quoting yourself. In your speech this May, you mentioned the fact that we were going to achieve peace not through common ideals, but rather through an acknowledgement of common interest. Could you say something?
Yes. I think that we Americans are, I think I can start with something on the other line there. I'll get to your point. I remember Khrushchev on one occasion when he was a little warmer than he was in the kitchen. Part of the kitchen times he was warm too.
Sure.
But on one occasion we were sitting in a dinner in the Kremlin, and he was looking around the table there, and he pointed over to Kozlov. Kozlov was the deputy premier, a big bombastic communist type and so forth, very humorless. And Khrushchev looked over to him and he said, "Comrade Kozlov is a hopeless communist." Now, what he was trying to tell me there, that Khrushchev was not a hopeless communist, that he was more of a pragmatist. As I look at Americans, and this I say as a commendation, we are hopeless idealists about peace and the like. We like to believe. We believe that people sincerely might agree with us about our view of the world and so forth. And we think if we just can convince people that we're for peace, that they're going to be for peace too. And that isn't the way the world works. Not the world where the communists are concerned and we are. What we have to understand is that we are going to continue for the balance of this century, perhaps even for the next century. We're going to continue to live in a time when the communists and the nations that they rule will be trying to expand their domination over other nations, building a communist world. And we will be trying to defend what we have and to bring about peaceful change, we trust, in their areas. So under the circumstances, then, what we have to recognize here is that we can have peace, but it must be a peace based not on the fact that we agree and that we resolve our differences. We're never going to do that. But based on the proposition that we profoundly disagree, but that we have determined that we're going to set up a process, a continuing process, for talking about and negotiating about our disagreements and our differences rather than fighting over them. I think I could summarize it this way as far as what our attitude should be. At this kitchen debate, Harrison will remember that Khrushchev at one occasion shouted at me, "Your grandchildren will live under communism." And my answer was, "We don't mind your saying that, but we will object if you try to bring that about by force." The clash of ideas between communism and freedom will go on for years and years and years. We can't object to that going on. What we do object to is the use of force or subversion to bring it about. And that is the least that we are going, and the most, the least we should insist upon, and the most we are going to be able to achieve.
Great.
Thank you.
I think that winds it up, and it's been great. Just wonderful. Just one.
Well, we've sort of rambled a bit, but
Well, that's
you can
all right.
edit it in the
That's
way
all
that
right.
you want.
That's all right. Yes. You bet. You bet.
Yeah, we could go on and on.
Well, I don't think there's much limit where we can.
Now that we're off the air, I'll tell you what that was. I got it in